Hi everyone, this is Sean Berry here. I took a bit of a hiatus as we had quite a few guests on our previous sessions with the Lunch with Larry series, but I'm back. I'm really excited for today as Larry provides an update to our ventilator project around Medtronic and brings the design excellence thread he's been shepherding all of May to a close. And also, clue the community in here of what's to come in June. So with all that being said, Larry, if you could please take it over and introduce yourself for those who are unfamiliar to you.
Yeah, sure. Great to have everybody on again today. Thanks for the discussion. This is going to be a fun session to sort of round up a little bit of what's going on with the ventilator project, some of the design activities that we've been involved in, and how those activities relate to one another. So this is the last of our series related to design excellence, and the next session is going to be operational excellence. So we're going to talk about some of the activities rolling from design, so design transfer, and then the progression into simulation of the processes, and of course on the back end manufacturing execution. And excited to have Cisco Vicente. He's going to be the next session, and he's going to come in and talk about his program, which is the case for quality, and how it relates to the COVID-19 response. So we'll talk about that a little bit at the end, but really excited about the next series. So look forward to go ahead and scan it in and get yourself registered. Love to have you on the next session as well. And of course, this is all my contact information. If you want to get a hold of me through LinkedIn, through the LinkedIn group, or email or phone or whatever, happy to answer any questions that you might have. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the session. What I talked about before was really what we're trying to do from a ventilator project perspective. So Siemens has an incredibly broad portfolio of tools, and what we came to the conclusion of is that this broad portfolio is a little bit, from a customer standpoint, disassociated. So people look at all our tools and can't really understand how these tools work together, how these tools operate, what's different about them, and don't have an example that's a cohesive example across the entire portfolio. So this opportunity, as COVID came up and Medtronic made publicly available their ventilator data set, and we said, okay, well, this is an opportunity for us to pull in a single data set on a real product and provide it in an environment that could actually be used in the production environment. And so that's really the nature of this entire project. And so what we're doing in this webinar series is we're following the execution of this project throughout the product lifecycle. And so what we're doing is building examples for each one of these tools and to give you a better sense of how the tools work together, how they operate, and the value that they can bring. So very exciting project from my perspective, because it gives me the opportunity to really show folks how all these tools operate together and do it in the context of a project that's really specific to medical device and very pertinent to the current time. So this is where we're going. And so different categories of work are we're running all the way from the patient to the post-market surveillance and feedback cycle. And so we've got lots of examples, but we start with the patient lung models. We move into disposables design and simulation, to the ventilator design itself, and then into the manufacturing process and simulation process, and then post-market intelligence. How do we collect data from those devices in the field, share it back in, and put it in the context of product and user risk? So that's really the goal of the project and what we've been up to. So current status on our project, I'm just going to give you sort of the brief overview. We've propped up and deployed all our tools now. So we have design control, PLM, manufacturing execution. Those are the three big platform products that Siemens sells. So Polarian is our design control solution, requirements management and test and risk. PLM is the design authoring central piece of this, and then manufacturing execution is our CAMSTAR product. In addition to that, we have a bunch of tools. So we have the mechanical design, and in this case, we're looking at the NX tool, product performance simulation. So a whole variety of very robust set of simulation tools, of which so far we've talked about the system simulation, but there'll be more on that to come in the future after our operational excellence discussion and set of webinars. I think we have 4 scheduled. After that, we'll probably come back to operation or to design excellence and talk about mechanical modeling and the product simulation aspects of the portfolio. In addition to that, we've talked about electrical design already. We did a session last week on schematics and PCB design. And then, of course, electrical simulation. There's a whole set of simulation just associated with the electronics of the device. Of course, all those systems have been deployed, and now we've imported open source data from Medtronic and populated that with specific designs around PCB schematics. And we also have a nice 3D modeling example for you to show you in this presentation as well. So that's kind of the current status. And now let's just go ahead and talk about some of those artifacts and so how some of those artifacts sort of link to one another. So again, the value that we're trying to communicate here, we have productivity, speed, and quality, right? And everything that we've shown you in this design excellence series so far is really related specifically to productivity. What are these world-class design tools and how do they operate with one another? So in the future, we're going to be talking more. And this last session, we talked some about the ECAD, MCAD, so this integration between the design tools. And we're going to talk a lot about quality. So how do we manage complexity and do that in the context of FDA and ISO sort of regulatory vernacular so that we can provide that data back to any of our stakeholders, either discipline related or regulatory related. We can provide that data back in a format that makes sense to them. And so hopefully when we're done with this, we end up with a system that really enhances and encourages design innovation. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and walk through the work that we've already done. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about model-based systems engineering and how that relates to requirements. So as I said, we've deployed the model-based systems engineering tool. In addition to that, we've deployed Polarian, which is our requirements management solution. And these two activities are really inherently different, but it's not always clear. And one of the things I wanted to sort of touch on a little bit is how it is that these two tools and the activities that we're doing in the two tools, how are they different and how do they relate to one another? And so now we have this specific example where we've built out in the systems modeling workbench the ventilator model, and that ventilator model has certain attributes associated with it. So what I'm going to do here is just talk about how the functions that we've defined in the systems model relate to the requirements in the requirements management tool and help give you a sense of what's the difference between a function and maybe a system requirement as an example. So here what we're looking at is our top level operational model in the systems modeling workbench tool. And so in this case, what we're doing at the operational level is we're really saying, what is the environment that we're working in? So what are the tasks and what is, when I try to give a patient a therapy, what are all the things that I should be concerned about? And just trying to get our hands around what is the space that we're working in. And so in this case, we have a patient, we have a clinician, and a patient support system and a hospital support system. And what we try to do is just say, if we're doing this manually, how is it that we would accomplish this task? And I'm just going to outline a few things here as we go along, because in this model, what we've done is we've defined monitor patient vitals as something that needs to occur in order for us to convert the ventilator air to blood oxygen. And so we have this function, and we're setting that function on a clinician. And so what we would expect then, if we're doing this process manually, is the clinician would monitor all the patient's vitals. And we haven't really defined what those vitals are. What we've just said is we have to understand what the status of the patient is. And so this really does a nice job of sort of getting everything on the table so that we can start to say what is in our system and what isn't in our system. Now I'm going to go to the systems model, and hopefully this isn't too much of an eye chart. I'm trying to provide you with some detail here. And so what we do then in the second piece of this, and maybe what I can do is, if I can find my little sketcher tool here, I'm going to go ahead and circle some things. But what we're trying to do here is we're building out the ventilator. And so this ventilator is our system that we're going to actually be building and selling to customers. So we're saying in this diagram, we're saying what is inside the box that we're going to be building and what's outside of the box. So you can see then that we did this monitor patient vitals, and we said, okay, this monitoring the vitals is going to be part of the clinician responsibility. And we haven't defined what those vitals are yet. So what you can imagine is, I'll just give you an example. Maybe we're going to measure pulse oximetry, so we're going to measure the oxygen saturation of the patient's blood. And then we're also going to measure maybe, call it pH. And we decide as part of the implementation of this program that we're going to need both of those vitals measured, and we're going to measure one of those vitals with a clinician where they're going to do a finger prick, and we're going to actually spill the blood out into a capillary tube, and we're going to do the pH monitoring offline. But maybe what we want to do is take this oxygen sensor and make it part of the system. So the ventilator actually would carry the data, and the system or the oxygen sensor would be part of the ventilator system. So what we might do in the perspective of the last discussion that we just had is, if we look back at that, I got to get off of this pen, sorry about that. If we go back to the previous slide, we're saying that these vitals carried by the clinician, we're going to want, from an embodiment standpoint, we're going to want to split that up into two places. We're going to have the clinician carry the pH monitoring, and we're going to have the system carry the oxygen saturation monitoring. Now, the reason this is important, when we start to get down into requirements, the requirements define performance, right? How is it that we're going to assure that this aspect of the system works properly, and how are we going to test it? Well, one of the problems with that is when we do that kind of an activity, it matters how we're going to embody the product. So you can imagine, if I were going to embody the product in such a way that the clinician carries all the vital management, what the requirement would be is that perhaps we'd have an internal standard that stated how we'd manually do that measurement. So maybe we'd have a pulse oximetry system that plugs into a different system in the hospital, and we have a procedure for how that would be done. That procedure would govern how that system works. In addition to that, maybe we do the finger prick, and we have a manual procedure inside the hospital that says how we're going to do the stick, how we're going to clean the wound site, how we're going to use a capillary tube and move it off into another device for testing. Now, if we do this inside the system, you can imagine it would be a very different embodiment, because now what we would be talking about is integrating the pulse oximetry system into the main design. And there would be a standard associated with how that would be done. So you can imagine that when we get to the systems engineering piece of this, the systems requirement piece, identifying where these different activities, where these functions live, is critical to how we're going to progress out into the requirements. We can't do requirements outside the context really of the design, is what I'm driving at. So having both tools so that we can locate and understand architecture is very important to helping us understand how we're going to build out those requirements and how those requirements are built in context. So hopefully that's clear. So future direction on this, we're going to have mapping of the requirements in the reports. We're going to model to evaluate two-patient use. So this is just future work, and we'll talk a little bit about how we've shown that in our system simulation, but we want this model and all the mechanical models to reflect two-patient systems. We're going to propagate and evaluate the product requirements, V&V, and risk. So not only are we going to have this systems model, but we're going to have a full a requirement set that's full enough that we can demonstrate how we would progress that into a risk evaluation. And of course, the product performance traceability. How is it that we show performance all the way down through simulation and into post-market? So those are the future activities. So now let's talk. I'm going to go to the next slide here. This is really an example around sterilization. And so I'm going to give you an example as we progress. So these use functions that we've developed inside of the systems modeling workbench get replicated into this tool. And so in this case, we have a function that is to present the sterile device to the surgeon. And we have a user need that the device will be sterile. So one example of system requirements then would be to say the way we're going to establish that sterility is through compliance with 11135. Now, that system requirement carries with it all of the design requirements, the IQ, OQ, PQ, and the validation requirements associated with EO sterilization. but we can't define those system requirements or that particular system requirement without first understanding that the device needs to be sterile, how that device is going to be presented to a physician, and what is the sterilization method. So you can imagine that system requirement has a lot baked into it, right? What is it that we're going to use the system requirement for has to do with what is the requirement going to be and how we're going to progress that through the requirement set. So that 11135 would be associated with a system architecture that defines how that product is going to be presented to the surgeon, under what conditions. For example, you might do steam sterilization, autoclave instead of doing EO, and that would change, you know, which system requirement we're going to have here. That would change the nature of the system requirement and the whole progression throughout the requirement set. So you can imagine now, if we have a pulse oximetry that's in the system, I would have a different set of documents that I would be compliant with than if I were just doing it as a manual system and we're just going to build out in the labeling a set of instructions as to how to do that manually. So if that all makes sense, I think what you're starting to see is system requirements are really a very different thing than the system functions, and the relationship between the two and the purpose of the two is really very different. And the great thing about the system requirement then is we can progress it down through the V model. So we could say we have a system requirement that's a 11135. Now we can have design requirements that refine that system requirement, and we can have design specifications that get very granular about how we're going to be compliant with that standard, all the way down to, you know, we're going to have a bag seal and it's going to be a 3/8 inch seal, you know, this kind of thing. So just to provide you with that traceability, because in the past, what we've talked about is we have this this progression that happens, and there's a negative view of the design, which is really what this risk analysis is. We're building out user needs and identifying use errors in a way that allows us to create a set of system requirements that are the result or the deliverable out of the risk analysis. This is really all about assuring that we don't have failure of the sterility of the device. That's a very different question than saying, do we need a device that's sterile? If it's sterile, how are we going to provide that sterility to the patient, right? The positive view really gives us the context so that we can process it through the negative view and develop our set of requirements. So hopefully that's a little more clear. Again, when we go to the systems FMEA, then what we're going to do is decompose that initial document into a set of design requirements, and then the design requirements into a set of specifications that can be pushed into production. So this is really the context for the left and the right of the design. We're really saying, how is it that we integrate all these activities into it? So hopefully that's clear. And as we move then into the rest of the systems model, this logical level, the functions that we create at the logical level would then map into the design requirements. And then the physical level, where we actually identify the components, would map into the design specifications. So we start to get down at this level, we're saying specifically. We're not saying, gee, we need you know, to monitor oxygen. What we're saying is the interface between the pulse oximeter on the patient's finger and the device is going to be you know, a 2-wire twisted connection or whatever, and here's the connector type, and here's where it connects to, and the modules that it's going to communicate with. So we get down to a very granular embodiment level at this physical level. So again, we have these models built out in the system. So we have not only the systems models, but also the requirement set and the traceability and the connection between those two. So hopefully that provides a little bit more granularity into how these two systems relate to one another. I kind of felt like in the last discussion that we had, it was a little vague. So I wanted to drive that home a little bit if we can. So now this systems model, and by the way, we have, and you'll get as part of an email, and I have it on one of the slides, the location for all the previous webinars. So every one of these really is contained in one of the previous webinars. And so you can go search through those. If you have a topic that you really like, you can go take a look and get more detail. But the system simulation model now takes those physical layered systems models and builds them out in a way that allows us to do if-then kind of questions. And you can see here in the slide, I've got and we showed it in the webinar on this, we actually are monitoring what we believe the O2 level is going to be based on a variety of different aspects of the system. You know, how big is the compressor for the ventilator? What's the stiffness of the patient's lungs? And in this case, we actually built out 2 patients with different lung stiffnesses. And what that allowed us to do is start to model what do we believe the O2 level of the air going into the patient is going to be based on 2 patients that have different capacities, maybe different stiffness of lung, and what we would expect to see in a performance degradation if we put 2 patients on the system in parallel instead of just one, which of course would lead us to new design options. We'd try to figure out then, you know, how to valve between the 2 patients to assure that they both get an appropriate level of oxygen. So that was really what this system simulation was about, is saying, what are these questions that we can answer? So different lung stiffness might be one question we could answer. Also, maybe what should the sizing of the compressor be? So if we have this unintended use of the device that says we're going to put 2 patients on it and we have X capacity on these lungs, is the sizing of the compressor appropriate? Are we going to overtax the system? Or are we going to burn the compressor out, right? Can the system handle that kind of volume? And we would be able to simulate those activities between the 2. And so this whole model has been built out as part of this data set as well. So I'm going to go ahead to the mechanical design piece of this too, just to give you a status of where we're at on the mechanical design. Not only have we imported the ventilator and the data associated with the ventilator into the project, but in addition to that, we built out a disposable tube set. In this case, what you're seeing is a trach. So this is a tracheal access for the disposable. In addition to this, we're building out an endotracheal tube set. And also we're going to be doing a 2-patient set. And so this is a design that we built off of a part that we purchased online, so reverse engineered tube set. And what we're going to do with the systems modeling is we're going to show if we bifurcate the ventilator tube and run 2 patients, what is the impact of that? Does it matter if we have longer tube sets on one side versus the other? Or one of the questions that we'd like to answer from a simulation perspective using computational fluid dynamics is, you know, when we put 2 patients on the system, would we risk contamination of one patient's biology with the other patient? Can we get backflow problems? Are there pressure differential problems that would create a problem where if someone had COVID on, you know, if one of the patients had COVID and the other one didn't, would it put us in a situation where we would contaminate one patient with the other? Also, there's a ton of if-then questions that we can do with the simulation. We can look at the disposable interface, the ventilator function, as we talked about a minute ago, duplication, and in addition to that, we're going to do quite a bit of simulation in and around the electronics, which we'll talk about more. We also have a relationship, as you might imagine, with Siemens Healthineers. Siemens Healthineers has a set of lung models, and we're working on getting the rest of these are lung models that were built into our current set, but a database of lung models that would allow us to then take a couple hundred different lung model types and use those as part of our product simulation examples. So that's really the direction we're going from a mechanical modeling standpoint. Just to give you a sense of kind of where we're at, I would expect that this is really going to blow out. In our next series on design excellence, we'll start to get more specific about the product simulation, and the patient modeling is going to be a big part of the examples that we build out as part of that webinar series. So I really look forward to showing you some of that activity when we get to it. Another example here, what we did in the ventilator, you can see in the original slide, there's on the left side here, there's a nose part that is a connection point to the disposable set. In addition to that, so what we've done here as part of the mechanical design is to say there are also going to be activities that aren't related to systems engineering. And so maybe what you have is a situation where you have these 3 different parts that were part of the nose design. These are all designed as injection molded parts. And what we are hypothesizing here is we have a problem with supply of one of the parts. Well, maybe one of the ways that we fix this is we take the 3 parts that are pressed together, and we redesign those parts into a 3D modeled part, one 3D modeled part that we can use and fabricate in 3D printing. And so what we've done at this point with the model is taken those three models, and of course what you can do is use the geometry that is contained inside each one of the parts that are provided, and then use that geometry to fashion the new part. And so all the previous parts that were there, we're reverse engineering those parts from a modeling perspective and providing the geometry to the new 3D model part. Now you can imagine when we do 3D modeling on this level, what it allows us to do is more of a generative engineering kind of setup where we can start to use simulation to drive the content of the design. So you can imagine that one case of how we would design this part might be that we wanted to do weight reduction. If we did that, then what we can do is set the loading conditions, run simulation, and the system will make the connection points in such a way as to handle the loading conditions. So if you wanted to do a weight reduced part, this would be a great example of how you could build that out. You might do meshing on the inside of some of the solid parts, and all this geometry is possible as a result of doing 3D modeling work. Or maybe what you would be more interested in is just redesigning it, the three parts into one, and it's okay if we don't minimize the amount of material. We want to do it quickly and don't want to worry about any of the loading conditions and validating that, so we just build it out as one solid part. Lots of options from a design standpoint. Now, just whatever your intent is, what you're trying to accomplish, you can really make some progress. The cool thing about this too is now, from a cost standpoint, you might say, gosh, 3D printing takes a long time. Many improvements around that, by the way, but maybe it takes longer than an injection molding part, so I doubt that I'm going to be able to get the cost of it out of it. But in this case, what we have is we're replacing three parts, and not only three parts, but three parts and the tooling. And in addition to that, the assembly work that's required to put those parts together all goes away. So it might very well be that this new 3D printed part, you might get a 40% increase or whatever in the cost of the part. But what you do is you reduce the amount of tooling, the amount of effort required to put those parts together and assemble them into your product. And so it might very well, from a total cost standpoint, be half as much as it would cost to do the parts separately. So especially in low volume parts where you're saying, you might spend $60,000 on tooling for three parts, maybe it's more, $100,000 on tooling. That pays for a lot of parts if you're only going to build 2,000 a year or something. So very compelling set of activities here. I'm happy to talk to you about all that work. And so the last slide I was going to talk about from our current progress, this last that we had talked about how to take schematics, build those schematics into the PCB and drive your 3D design automatically from the schematics and the PCB design. And then roll the mechanical design, so do the ECAD, MCAD discussion to provide the mechanical layout to the electronic designers, and then do that negotiation back and forth between the mechanical package and the electronics to get that collaborative engineering effort going. And so this is an excellent discussion, I think, in how that kind of work can be done and how we can go back and forth between our mechanical and electrical designers. And this whole example has been built into the model as well. So future direction really is in how we're going to, so this next series, and I'll just go ahead and drop to the next series slide. The next series is really around operational excellence. And what we're going to do, first session, of course, we'll talk to Cisco about his Case for Quality program and how it relates to COVID-19 activities. Should be a great session. Look forward to having Cisco on the program. After that, what we're going to do is roll through operational excellence in sort of a big chunk kind of way. This manufacturing simulation, we're going to talk about manufacturing simulation. We're going to talk about manufacturing execution. And I think we're also going to talk about design transfer. How is it that we take these designs that we've built, the 3D printed design, the electronics design, and how are we going to push that into a set of activities that allows us to do our take our engineering BOM, translate it into the manufactured BOM, and then get a bill of process out of it. So when we're done with our design activities, the transfer happens seamlessly into production. So look forward to that. Our operational excellence session should be coming up here shortly, and look forward to really having as many as you as possible on this discussion with the FDA. I'm excited to have Cisco on the program as well. So thank you so much for your time today. Hopefully that provides you with sort of a brief overview of what we've gotten through on the design excellence side, and look forward to talking to you next week. So thanks so much. Have a great day.